Yes. So welcome everybody. For those having lunch there without me, I'm kind of jealous because I'm hungry right now. But also for all the Zoomers out there, especially my mentor, Carol Hosenfeld, Nora Jones, podcaster extraordinaire, my co-author, Diana Ruggiero, and I see that we have several contributors to our recent volume, World Languages for Specific Purposes, The Future is Blended. And also, I believe we have two of my colleagues and co-authors, Mary Vigier and Amy Church-Morel from France, and one of our contributors from Serbia, Milevika Bočović. So welcome to you all. And again, thank you to SMU for inviting me. One of the reasons why I wanted to share this with you, because I believe that workplace language research within the context of multinational corporations really holds promise for us as LSP instructors. Every LSP instructor, professional, researcher, etc., that I've ever met, one of their main goals is to make our courses as authentic as possible. And I think the voices from the workplace, which could have been the title of this presentation, hearing and observing the voices of the workforce or the workplace will definitely give us a lot of insights into creating even better courses. Next slide, please. So how did I get started in this? I got started in this at about age 8 because my father, we had a family business selling janitorial supplies in Chicago. He forced me to ride on the truck with him to deliver mops, brooms, concrete cleaner, etc., to over 200 different workplaces. So we're talking hotels, restaurants, laundries, car dealerships, etc. So from age 8 to age 18, my father forced me to ride on the truck with him. And you got to remember that at that time, there were no cell phones, no video games. All I had was to watch him in action, unload the truck and stuff, and watch the interactions between him and his customers. And then when I was sitting, to have a protruding metal spring in my butt. So I just had to watch, to observe, to note the business activities going on around me. So it's really interesting. And my father spoke a modicum of different languages with his customers: Cantonese, Spanish, Italian, Yiddish, Calabrese dialect, which is our home dialect. And so that's what really got me into languages, because when my dad did his little monologues with his customers, I think he did it to ensure customer intimacy, um, his customers were always laughing. So I memorized those dialogues and got in huge trouble the first time I ever used Cantonese with two Chinese gentlemen when I was with my mother. I repeated his little monologue, and they were shocked and asked my mother where I had learned such foul language. So I guess my father was greeting them and also insulting them at the same time, but they were always laughing. So that's where I got my street MBA in being in the family business, even though later on I got 2Ds in accounting, which ended my academic business career. Later, when we got done at age 18 and went to college, I always felt close whenever I was a teacher or whenever I was an academic, to be close to business organizations and to partner with them, like state departments of commerce, world trade centers, chambers of commerce. And from my end, I strove to help them enhance their global mission by listening intently, like my dad did, and include them into grant-funded projects or develop workshops for them or on-site language courses or whatever they needed. In exchange, I asked them for their input in the design of my LSP courses, study abroad, and internship programs. Next slide, please. So my research basically, which I started in retirement at age 61, involves over 250 managers and workers representing 150 multinational corporations or SMEs or small and mid-sized enterprises in both the US and the Francophone Africa. Next slide, please. And some of these include Archer Daniels Midland, Cargill, two agribusiness giants, Caterpillar, which we all know, Ericsson, General Electric, which everybody knows, of course, Nestle, Olam, Schlumberger, Unilever, and many others. Next slide, please. So the goal of my research is to better understand language and cultural problems within MNCs and to help multinational corporations solve communication problems. And believe me, they all have communication problems. And then also to translate those findings to enrich LSP programs. Next slide, please. So here's my first venture into LSP. And also working with a multinational corporation. It took place in 1979 when I was a French and Spanish teacher at Salem Community High School in Salem, Illinois, population 7,000. And so basically what happened is Bettendorf Stanford, the world's premier food slicing equipment company, who sold their equipment to companies throughout the French-speaking world, contacted me because they received dozens of letters that needed to be translated from French to English. And they paid me $5 a letter. And at that time, I was only making $16,000 a year. And during the summer, I was a fry cook at a local restaurant and some other work activities in order to make more money to travel to France later on in the summer. And so, of course, these managers and employees at Bettendorf Stanford were monolingual business and engineering school graduates. So the idea came to me that why don't I do this in my French 3 and 4 class? So I talked to them. They said they sounded really excited, especially when I told them that I would pay them the $5 per letter when they were done correctly, and I checked over them very carefully. So basically, I started creating a course in business communication that I learned at the University of Illinois from a French who wasn't even an instructor. She was a bilingual secretary. And I took those materials and translated them into materials that my students could use. So I never did tell my principal that my students were making $5 a letter. In fact, some of my students were making more than they made at McDonald's working and learning French in my class. I never told my principal because I probably would have gotten fired. Next slide, please. So jumping a few years later from 1979, I want to talk to you and focus on two studies that I've done, one in a Northern California rice mill and the other with Women in Logistics Africa, located all throughout Francophone Africa. So how do you get these gigs? For me, I've gotten 3 of my consulting gigs from my former students. It's probably the only reason why I use Facebook, as well as keeping in touch with my family in Calabria. And so one of my former students, 40 years after he left my world history class, his name was Spud Becker. Spud Becker was president of the FFA, Future Farmers of America. And so when Spud contacted me in May of 2015, he reminded me that his name was no longer Spud, but now Senior Vice President Jeff Becker of a huge multinational corporation. So basically, after 3 conference calls with his bosses in headquarters in central Illinois, these senior officials were keenly concerned about 2 issues: addressing safety issues when 2 languages are intertwined during daily operations in their mills nationwide, And two, finding an effective solution to enforce the use of English as the lingua franca of business. They claimed that they were an English only company worldwide, and they wanted Hispanic migrant workers to be working in English. So that was my mission. So this particular company, whose name I won't mention, as per their suggestion, has over 30,000 workers in 150 countries. Then all of their mills and processing centers, 80% of their workers are Hispanic migrant workers. They have a few Vietnamese and Haitian Creole speakers in their logistics division, but for the most part, they are Hispanic migrant workers. I asked them, why did you hire Hispanic migrant workers? And they said, best workers in the world. So that's what I was walking into. So my mission was to develop for them an English program for Hispanic migrant workers. So at the time of my visit, mill workers use Spanish in everyday work situations, from daily meetings to report writing. Communication with senior mill managers required the use of a translator, and nearly all of their reports were written in Spanish, requiring an English translation as mandated by OSHA. So basically, again, a dual language zone or dual language zones, English in the office, Spanish in the mills. So the first thing that I found out right off the bat, safety is everything. Any company with 10 or more employees has to adhere to OSHA standards. So before they would even allow me on the mill floor, I had to study. I had to get the proper PPE, including steel-toed boots from the local Kmart, and I had to pass a test, getting 29 out of 30 correct before having access to the plant. So just a quote from a grant proposal that I wrote with an ag professor from the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. The U.S. Department of Labor's Occupational Safety and Health Administration identifies grain handling, which includes rice milling, as one of the most dangerous endeavors in American labor. Workers are exposed to hazards such as fires and explosions from grain dust accumulation, suffocation from engulfment, entrapment in grain bins, falls from heights and crushing injuries and amputations from grain handling equipment. Insufficient safety training and limited English proficiency put Hispanic immigration or immigrant co-workers at risk of injury or death. And so just to give you an example, during my week at this particular company, 3 migrant workers died, 2 in a rival rice mill, and 1 died in an agricultural accident. So I had to pass the safety test just like every worker entering the mill. And basically, after the second try, first try, I got 7 wrong out of 30. And they basically said, for our workers, if they don't get 29 out of 30 the second time, they don't get the job. So basically got 29 out of 30 the second time. And then on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, I got to spend a lot of time interviewing. Please advance the slide. Interviewing. Oh, one more slide too, please. Sorry. And actually one more. And actually one more. Sorry, I'm a techno-idiota, techno-idiot. So basically what I did during this time, using ethnographic methods, I interviewed 26 Mexican workers who were forklift operators, graders, millers, mill hands, stretch wrappers, and all the different activities to find out more about their background, where they were born, how much English they had, and then I measured their English language proficiency using an actual oral proficiency interview. The observations consisted of daily observations of all 10 workstations and their activities. I had the opportunity to observe each station and worker activity thoroughly in all of the 4 days after I passed my test. When it comes to information collection, I gathered safety record data. It's an interesting thing because this company gave me total access to anything I wanted except time. They said, you got a week and that's it. And then we got to get back to work. So I got employee records as well and instructional materials because the workers did their studying of safety um, regulations in Spanish, and they got to take their test in Spanish. I also asked for recorded decibel levels because in a prior visit to Procter & Gamble in Green Bay, 80 decibels required hearing protection. And in contrast, at a mill visit to a paper mill in Mexico in 1996, there was no hearing protection at all, which I was told would lead to major hearing loss for those particular Mexican workers. So imagine these workers on the floor, they have headphones, big headphones along with their other PPE, and they have, again, over 100 decibels. So basically, oops, let's see, I think I skipped. No, I'm okay here. So basically, my findings were limited English proficiency. So in this case, we had 9 novice level speakers of English, 11 intermediate speakers, and 6 advanced level speakers. The use of Spanish totally 100% in the mill, since monolingual managers were seldom seen on a plant floor. Workers used Spanish because it was convenient, efficient, and safe. So safety, as I mentioned, is everything. Any deaths or major injuries led to a complete shutdown of the mill by OSHA. And you can imagine the negative impact on productivity when nothing's going on in those particular mills. Next slide, please. So the key finding that I wanted to share with you is that these workers, because of dealing with 100 plus decibels, and to give you an idea of what that's like, for those of you who are football fans, it would be similar to play calling in the Super Bowl with 100,000 fans, or teaching class on an airport runway. So in their compact communication code, they use short phrases, short sentences, gestures in Spanish. And basically, they were like within inches of each other's noses as they were communicating during that time in this compact communication code. Next slide, please. So, and these safety standards included working at home, because if they slipped in the shower or did anything else, basically it worked against the mill safety record. So imagine no workplace accidents in 8 years despite working in Spanish. So you might ask yourself, why mess around with this and risk the possibility of trying to speak English and running into injuries and deaths? So imagine 8 years of no accidents. So what they were doing basically was very, very effective. The next slide, please. So my warning to the company is basically just like with the airline industry crashes due to poor communication skills in English. I basically said, let them work in Spanish. We can teach them English, so when they come to the work, when they come to the managerial area in the offices, then they would be required to work in English. They said no. So basically, we went ahead. Next slide, please. And so the response, and basically, I came up with the course with the help from another student, Wendy Fike Pinkerton, who owns her own agribusiness consulting firm. And at San Diego State, we have the Language Acquisition Resource Center. So the guys who helped to create and customize courses in South Asian and Middle Eastern languages for the U.S. Navy SEALs, we had worked together for a couple decades. They helped in the creation of an online safety English program that would be used worldwide. So we gave them a contract, basically for $500,000. And what was interesting is they flew us in December 2015 to conduct a presentation to senior corporate officials. We did a slide presentation and question and answer session. Immediately, they gave us the go-ahead. They signed the papers for the contract and then stopped. And basically, they wanted to spend the rest of the time asking us about the U.S. Navy SEALs. So we answered their questions, and it's kind of off track, but we were so happy that that we got the contract. Then here's what happened, and this happens a lot of times with contracts with corporations. In January, they got their annual report, which was lower. Their financials were lower than they expected, and so they put it on hold for a year. Then in 2017, we got a new president, and they weren't sure how the new president would deal with illegal immigration. And I suspected that many of my interviewees were illegal immigrants, even though I didn't ask them. So they put us on hold for yet another year. And then in 2018, they said, we're going to just let them work in Spanish, which was fine for me. I would have liked to have had the opportunity to earn $500,000 and to create a great program. But Diana Ruggiero and I are going to do that type of program later on with a federal grant. So the next slide, please. So the feasibility of English only policy, because that's what a lot of corporations are heading to. English only, like Rakuten, they call it Englishnization, which is not even a word, all English all the time. But an interesting thing to report to you, Rakuten will fire any employee, even in Japan, if they're speaking Japanese. But I found out that Rakuten, their staff in Francophone Africa, they all use French with their customers. So all English all the time, I guess, when it's convenient. So when you think about the feasibility of English only, there is none. It's virtually impossible to overturn multilingual workplaces. And the best news that I can share with you all is that most workplaces worldwide need bilingual managers and bilingual staff. That means our students. So next slide, please. So here's a informal follow-up study I did for the managers, the senior officials at this particular company headquartered in Central Illinois. I wanted to find out, and this was a study I just simply did on LinkedIn. So here's a quote from one of my articles. After the rice mill, I informally tested the English-only policy of the same United States-owned global agribusiness in its overseas operations via LinkedIn. I interviewed non-native English-speaking engineers working in 11 countries on 4 continents, engineers, managers, and agronomists from Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Cameroon, Chile, Germany, Cote d'Ivoire, the Netherlands, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Vietnam participated in the LinkedIn interviews. My findings: mixed language use also takes place in their overseas operations, much like it does at the rice mill in Northern California. So in essence, these managers, these senior officials have no idea what languages are being used overseas, even though they insist that outside the United States, they always speak English 100% of the time. One respondent admitted, few of us work with English in our day-to-day. Another respondent working in Germany stated the main language is German for local communication, but if more than one employee or country non-German speaking person is involved, English is the language. Or as many of them told me, when the English speaking bosses come around, we go back to English. Next slide, please. So one of the things I wanted to share with you, because this is one of the major pieces of good news, as I just mentioned, the MVPs of the rice mill were bilingual managers, not even the workers who were tremendous, and the managers who were excellent managers, but the bilingual managers, many of them near native speakers of native speakers of Spanish, but also LSP veterans who were near native speakers of Spanish. Their relationship building skills with both managers and workers, because they were constantly translating and kind of like serving as negotiators between the workers and the managers, was incredible. They were great troubleshooters. They could solve complex problems. They could basically help to improve communication and also to improve the feelings of workers who constantly felt that they were going to lose their jobs unless they learned to become near native speakers of English. So again, where LSP programs come into play, they were truly MVPs of the mill, and that's great news for our students that you can share. With every study, especially with ethnographic studies, there's always the researcher's regrets. If I had time and if I had thought about it, I would have stayed an extra week, not at the mill, but interviewing workers' families, because they would have given me a lot of insights that I didn't come away with talking to their husbands or their wives. Not asking workers to take the safety test in English just to get a sense, a baseline measure of what their safety English abilities would be like. And especially not taping compact communication code for use for discourse analysis later on, because it would have been great to show you kind of like a little exchange of what their compact code was like. And also finding out why GAI, which is the pseudonym of the company, why it changed its mind about the online safety English course. Okay, next study, please, or next slide, please. Okay, the next one that I want to talk about for French teachers, French professors, and students in our audience. This is a series of 3 studies conducted in Francophone Africa. The first study was a study of 66 engineers via LinkedIn. So basically, that whole study, since I couldn't go back to Ivory Coast and to the other countries of Francophone Africa, I did it versus LinkedIn survey and then basically Zoom calls for follow-up interviews. The second study, which is the one that I want to share with you, is basically focusing on workplace language use within multinational corporations operating in Francophone Africa. And these women belong to Women in Logistics Africa, or WILA. Next slide, please. So in WILA, there were over 500 women and 124 study participants there. Next slide, please. So we conducted a survey. The president of WILA, Christiane Owen Traoré, was my co-author, and she's also the president. We gave them language histories to find out exactly what, in depth, what their experience with English was. And then we conducted follow-up interviews, I believe, with like 24 different women. So we basically interviewed women from Tunisia to Togo, from Morocco to Madagascar. Next slide, please. So what's interesting here is that 72.2% of respondents work in French. So they work 72% of the time in French. Mixed language use, just like at GAI, is tolerated despite the status of English as the official language in 85% of those companies. So interesting, in Europe, those companies force their employees to work in English. In Asia, same thing. But in Africa, they allow them to work in French. And the reason why we chose logistics and global supply chain management is because French seems to be the dominant language, even though everywhere else in the world, English is the dominant language at that particular point. Okay, again, let me point out my weaknesses. My weaknesses in these three studies is my lack of input from human resources directors to determine if mixed language use is tolerated and under what conditions. That's why I contacted my colleagues, Mary and Amy, who are on Zoom in France, because of their prior research with HR directors. And when it comes to workplace language research, they're much more advanced than I am. So they're kind of like my mentors, as well as Carol Hosenfeld with voices from the classroom. Next slide, please. Here's the one thing that doesn't really apply to those of us who do LSP, but it does for those who teach English for specific purposes. We would probably guess that English or speaking would be their main problem. It wasn't. All of their speaking scores were higher than their listening comprehension scores. So these are women with generic business English courses that were ineffective because they didn't solve their listening comprehension problem. So what we did was customize listening comprehension training for them. So here's an example of world Englishes. None of these women had been in Africa, had been educated by native speakers of English. The same thing for their customers in Southeast and Southern Asia. So imagine these guys are trying to communicate with different accents, with different semantics, with different lexicon, etc. And that, again, is something that I hope to be able to tape in the future, to be able to show their bosses, here's what's going on, and here's why we need to have you guys give them time to do these courses with me. So we're talking YouTube videos with a multitude of different English accents combined with comprehension checks instead of these generic business English courses. Okay, next slide, please. So going back to the GAI study, one major implication, especially for German, French, and Spanish teachers, Italian teachers as well, or anybody else, should we consider adding safety instruction to current LSP courses? And I know that's really a lot to ask. In French, I would say c'est la mer à boire. It's like drinking the ocean. But what if we did it online with different components that you guys could go in when you see a component that would fit into your current class? You could insert that in your particular course, along with a little bit of literature. Isabel Allende, the sum of our I forgot the name of the book, The Sum of Our Days, which talks a lot about Mexican migrant workers. But that's what Diana and I are at this point are trying to get a grant for, and I know that we will. J.J. Keller, a training company, says that it costs each a company $10,000 per worker to get them certified. What if our LSP students got OSHA certification when they were applying for the job? Wouldn't they have an advantage over non-certified applicants in job searches? Next slide, please. And sorry for rushing through this because I know that we've got limited time. But if you guys are interested in conducting workplace language research, please contact me. I'll show you my email address and would love to talk to you more about it. Number one, using former students as corporate liaisons, because many of our students are a lot more famous than we are, and they would be happy to work with us. Enlist assistance from continuing education colleges, because they have a lot of contacts with companies, research companies in your area. If you're, for example, in Memphis, like at the University of Memphis, there's probably 100 different agribusiness located within 50 miles of Memphis. 4, enlist assistance from local and state business organizations. And if you're not connected with them at this particular time, I would highly recommend it for you. And finally, that's the nice thing about LinkedIn. I look up LinkedIn HR managers, and so now I got about 50 LinkedIn managers from Francophone Africa for future use. Next slide, please. So one thing I wanted to tell you about, there's a grant project that we're working on, which would take place in the summer of 2024. It would consist of 2 to 3 week remote instruction option. And this would be for not only workplace language research, but also for strengthening empirical research skills, both quantitative and qualitative, for our student. And this would be for not only professors, but we're looking to add at least 50% LSP or future LSP instructors who are in graduate programs in Spanish, French, etc. So we would do remote instruction, like on Zoom, 6 hours a day per day. And then we would add a podcast option with Nora Jones, the top podcaster. I think in our field, it's about language. So we would have that other format for those who couldn't do remote instruction or who want to basically do that in addition to remote instruction. And then we would ask all of our contributors to try to design and create studies in this particular area. And so if we get $175,000 to $200,000 in this program, we would have $1,000 stipends for participants in the instructional end. And for those of you who submit a manuscript to a referee journal, we would pay you $1,000 for that. If you do 2 studies and we got money left, we'd give you $2,000. If you did both the remote course and podcast options, we would give you $2,000. And one thing that I didn't mention there is that we would have basically an award for both best student research and also best LSP research on the part of a professor. So one last thing here, and then we'll open up to questions. Here's my email address. Next slide, please. StephenJSacco52@gmail.com. Please contact me also on Facebook and LinkedIn so we can work. And let's leave it open for questions if we can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephen. So I will be monitoring both the chat online as well as questions that might be coming from those of us who are here in person. So if anyone would like to ask a question, Paula.
Start. Stephen, you mentioned doing studies on LinkedIn. In terms of releases and data that you collect, how does that work? Because we've encountered stumbling blocks in the past or in currently stumbling blocks in regards to data, and can we use the data, not use the data, and so on.
Exactly. In fact, here I'm no longer affiliated except as an emeritus professor, so I don't have to go through any committees like you do. But basically, I feel that it's highly ethical and it's imperative that we ask our participants, first of all, can we use this for a study? And second of all, is it okay if we were to use your name with no last name mentioned, like, Joseph P. And so at times, sometimes we'll put initials, like I did in our 3rd study, with a language school in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, or a lot of times we don't even use their names at all. We're just collecting data.
So just to follow up with that, if you were in an institution still, would you have to submit this through IRB?
Yes, in my days, back in the old days, we had to submit any kind of study using actual live subjects. We had to get permission and approval. But I'm not sure about what your policy is at SMU.
No, we would have to, that's
Yeah.
why I asked, because that would be. I have another question. Sorry, I took note. I have another. You mentioned the research with directors of HR directors. Is there any way you could put some information in the chat about that? I'm really curious.
Well, as I mentioned, that's my weakness. So the current study that Mary, Amy, and Anissa from Tunisia, they have a lot more business contacts and company contacts and HR contacts than I have. So I can put you in touch with them if it's okay with them. They would probably be able to answer that question better for you.
Thank you.
Because, you know, without the HR directors, we don't have triangulation. We're just, you know, we're accepting that workers who claim that they work 55% of the time in English, how do we know that? I can't observe them. And in all of my ethnographic studies, whenever possible, I observe, you know, there to have that to support me. The HR directors can basically say, no, that's not true. I'm with him like 10 hours a day and he speaks mostly French. So that's why HR directors are critically important and why it's important for me to work with colleagues, eminent colleagues like Mary and Amy and Anissa.
It's important also, I think, on our end to promote the relevance and importance of LSP to our students, because we can be very concrete and explain this is what the workplace wants. These are skills that you need, and these are the people who are saying you need the skills.
Exactly. Great point. Because what we don't want to do is, and nobody in LSP that I know of, you know, is an instructor in this way, but when I was at the University of Illinois and I was taking a methods class for high school teachers, my instructor, who was world famous, had never been in a high school classroom. So when I got into the classroom, the students are about ready to throw me out the window because I'm talking about communicative competence and this and that and blah, 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 you know, and they were using foul language with me and I wasn't prepared. I had to learn basically I learned more about high school teaching from being with my father on the truck than I did in the method. I never want to be in a position where, because, you know, most of us, you know, except for my colleague in Serbia, Milevica, she's got a background in the corporate world before she started teaching English for biotechnology and other courses. But most of us haven't had that experience. And certainly the Sacco Chemical Company in Chicago, Illinois was not a multinational corporation. So I was still at a major disadvantage myself.
I'll post a question to you, Stephen, that came in through the chat. One of our virtual attendees would like to know if you know of any work or research on language or communication for Vietnamese working in the nail salon business.
Ooh, no, but I would love to. I saw that there was a Vietnamese person. Toi la Steve Sacco. Toi you Vietnam. But I had a consulting gig in Vietnam, but had nothing to, it had more to do with global supply chain management and manufacturing engineering. But I don't know anything about it. I would need your guidance, but I can certainly contribute with methodological issues and would love to do that study with you.
Any other questions from any of you?
Stephen, what's the next step that universities can take? Let's take the example of SMU to further develop LSP.
Would love to work with you. Grant getting is one of my gigs. Like I mentioned, a month ago, I got $1 million for 2 of my clients. So there's still grant money out there, but it's just us working together, because I'm going to benefit as much from working with you as you will work for me. But also, is Diana and I create this program, online program in safety English and safety Spanish. We need feedback. Okay, we need feedback from SMU, from the University of Alabama, Birmingham, from whatever, the great universities that are doing LSP instruction. And so we would love to work with you at any particular time, not only on that project, but also in any other project that you're interested in with LSP.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No, I don't think we have any other questions for you, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
So please, one last thing, for those of you in Zoom or in person there, I'd love to work with you, whether you're a graduate student, undergraduate student, faculty member, or whatever the case. You want to ask questions or exchange information. And again, I'm always looking for future studies, like nail salons, which would be, which would be perfect. That would be a great study. Or, in the grant that I got for $1 million is basically for healthcare facilities in California. So, and my weakness is Spanish for healthcare, or and French for healthcare in Francophone Africa. So I would love to work with you guys in any future studies.